English 121, Day 25, Counterarguments, from the Allen and Bacon Guide, pages 343 to 347. Before we talk about counterarguments, let's quickly review the argument structure that we've been working with so far in this class. Remember that a logical construction involves a claim, a reason, as well as an underlying assumption that connects the claim to the reason. A skeptical audience can attack an argument by either attacking the writer's underlying assumptions, the explicitly stated reasons, or both. Good writers use evidence to support reasons and then, anticipating the reader's objection to their own underlying assumptions, summarize that objection and provide a response to it. Let's take a look at an example from the sample argument we've been working with so far in class. One reason why skiing is a better winter sport than snowboarding is because it has a longer tradition. There is a lot of evidence that people have skied for hundreds of years. John Matthews' book, Skiing and the Downfall of the Axis Forces, says that at least 12 key battles over the Swiss Alps were won because of the technology of skis in the U.S. Army and the British Special Forces. These battles conclusively stopped Germany from completing their first atomic weapon. This means that skiing was crucial in the U.S. winning the Second World War. This is just one example of how skiing has a longer tradition than snowboarding. Therefore, skiing is a better winter sport. Okay, so in the first paragraph here, we have a strongly constructed reason paragraph. You can see the writer presents the reason in a topic sentence at the beginning of the paragraph that connects to the overall thesis. The writer also sums up the reason at the end of the paragraph and provides a sentence that again connects it to the overall thesis. Then, in the middle of the paragraph, the writer uses the four-sentence model to develop the piece of evidence that's being used to support the reason. We have the intro set up here. We have the actual quote here. Down here, we have an interpretation of the quote. Then, again, we have a connection of the evidence to the point that's being made right before a connection to the thesis. Now let's look at how a writer might acknowledge a counterargument to this particular reason. Some people might argue that snowboarding is a better winter sport because it's trendier than skiing. It is just so hot right now, and a lot of people want some of the hardcoreness of snowboarding to rub off on them. However, it's important to not be blinded by bandwagon appeals that try to defend something just because it's popular. In fact, the first commercial skis, according to the Smithsonian Institute, went into production in 1912. The first snowboards didn't go into production until 1986. The 74 years in between have allowed skiing to develop into much more of an advanced and competitive sport than snowboarding has in the last 25 years. Therefore, the longer tradition that skiing has makes it a much better winter sport than snowboarding. Okay, so again, we have an acknowledgement of the counterargument up here. We have a connection to the point about it being a longer tradition down here, and then again a connection to the overall claim at the very, very end. Now also notice that this writer is again using the four-sentence model to develop the piece of evidence that's being used to refute the counterargument. There's an introduction here. There's the actual piece of evidence here. There's an interpretation of the evidence here, and then again a connection to the point and the claim at the end of the paragraph. Good writers attempt to support both their reasons and their underlying assumptions with evidence. And in order to determine what objections might be raised in the minds of your readers, let your analysis of the audience you're writing for be your guide. It's very important to get to know your audience very, very well so you can anticipate the kinds of objections that will come up in their mind as they are reading your argument. One of the best ways to approach counterarguments is to summarize them fairly. By resisting the temptation to distort a counterargument, you demonstrate a willingness to consider the issue from all sides. This goes a long way to build your ethos as a writer. After you have summarized an objection or counterargument fairly and charitably, you must then decide how to respond to it. Now, there are several ways you can go about refuting a counterargument. Once you have summarized the counterargument fairly, you can question the argument's reasons and supporting evidence, you can question the argument's underlying assumptions, or you can question both. So just like writers can question the reasons and the underlying assumptions in your writing, so too can you question the reasons and underlying assumptions in the counterarguments you're going to need to address. Be sure to analyze the argument's appeals to ethos, pathos, and logos as you attempt to refute it. You can find logical fallacies in the counterargument that will allow you to overcome its appeal with your readers. In some cases, the counterargument will be so strong that you can't refute it. In this case, don't hide it from your readers, simply summarize and concede to it. Making these kinds of concessions is not necessarily a sign of weakness, but it simply acknowledges that the issue you are discussing is very complex. A concession can actually enhance a reader's respect for the writer, and it can invite the reader to weigh the strengths of the argument charitably. Finally, use transitional expressions as you concede. These might be words like admittedly, even though, I agree that, I concede, while it is true that, granted, and more. After you have conceded to the counterargument, be sure to shift the argument to a different field of values where your position is strong, and then argue for that new set of values which presumably your audience is more charitable toward. So for example, if you have a counterargument about cost, you may have to acknowledge, yes, this is going to be very, very expensive, but then shift to a different field of values where you might say, although this is going to be very expensive, the outcome is extremely important. Therefore, we should enact X proposal despite the cost. Often, writers will feel the need to qualify their claims in light of counterarguments. That is, limit the scope or force of the claim to make it less broad and therefore less vulnerable. Unless your argument is airtight, you will need to limit it with qualifying words. These might include words like perhaps, maybe, may or might, in some cases or in many cases, generally it is true, or tentatively, sometimes this is the case, or often, or usually this is the case. It could probably be true or likely be true. Okay, it's up to you, but try to come up with words that you are comfortable using as you limit the scope or force of your argument to put the burden on your evidence less and to make it easier to overcome counterarguments.